A mother and her young daughter went camping alone in the desert and never returned, vanishing for over 11 years. But one day her son finds their empty truck deep in the desert. A discovery that would change everything and reveal the shocking truth about what happened to them. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Elijah Mercer's back as he trudged across the cracked, barren landscape of the Presidio County desert. The blazing heat wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket, relentless and punishing. Sweat soaked through his shirt, rolling in steady streams down his spine. His wide-brimmed hat offered little reprieve from the glare, and the metal detector in his hands felt heavier with every step. Yet he pressed forward with single-minded determination, eyes fixed on the endless horizon. Trailing a few feet behind, Trent Wilson moved with cautious steps, periodically checking his compass and swiping sweat from his brow. "Eli, you sure we're not walking in circles?" he called out, his voice thin against the wind. "We've been at this for hours." Elijah glanced over his shoulder, offering a strained smile. "Thanks for coming out here, man. I know this isn't your ideal weekend." Trent shrugged, adjusting his backpack. "A deal's a deal. You finally said yes to a date with Jenny, so here I am, lending you my Jeep and my gear. Still think she's getting the better part of this trade, though." A faint smile tugged at Elijah's lips but quickly faded. His gaze turned toward the Chinati Mountains looming in the distance, like ancient watchers over the desert. "It was exactly 11 years ago today," Elijah said, voice low, sweeping the metal detector in a steady arc. "Mom took Celine camping out here. I stayed with our grandparents. Thought camping was boring back then." He let out a dry chuckle. 15-year-old me had no idea. Trent stayed quiet, letting the familiar story unfold. Over the years, he'd heard Elijah recount it countless times, but each telling still carried the raw edge of grief and unresolved questions. "She said her dad used to bring her out here when she was little," Elijah continued, scanning the terrain. "Said those trips made her who she was. She wanted Celine to feel that too, not just grow up staring at screens. She called it part of our Texas heritage." A gust of wind kicked up a cloud of dust, prompting Trent to pull up his bandana. Elijah kept talking, needing the words like oxygen. "It was supposed to be one night, one simple night under the stars, then back home the next day." His voice cracked. "But they never came home, Trent. They just disappeared." Trent remembered the chaos that followed. The desperate search parties, the volunteers Elijah had rallied online, the law enforcement teams combing the region. Bottles of water, scraps of fabric, even a child-stuffed bunny. All clues that led nowhere. "After 4 years, they gave up," Elijah said bitterly. "Said maybe she just left, took Celine, started over somewhere. But I know my mom, she wouldn't do that. Not without a word, not to me." Trent nodded, understanding more than he said. Elijah's grandfather had never stopped searching. When he passed away 2 years ago, Elijah had taken up the torch with even greater resolve. "I think we should try somewhere new," Elijah said, halting and pointing west. "I've combed the usual zones so many times. What if they went further out?" Trent hesitated. "Rangers warned us about going too far west of the Chinatis. No signal, dangerous terrain. They said—" "Not that far," Elijah cut in. "Just beyond where the search stopped. Please, Trent." Trent took a long drink from his bottle, then capped it. "Fine, but you're not skipping that date with Jenny. She's waited long enough." They pushed on. The ground beneath them grew more rugged, each step trickier than the last. At what was likely their final patch of reception, Trent paused to send a location ping to his sister. "In case we don't make it back," he said with a dry smile. "Insurance." As they continued, the landscape turned increasingly alien. Jagged stones jutted from the earth, and narrow ledges tested their balance. After another grueling hour, Trent finally called it. "Greeley." "That's it," he said, panting. "We're low on water, no signal, and I'm pretty sure I saw a rattlesnake. This is exactly what they warned us about." "Just let me check that ridge," Elijah pleaded, pointing ahead. "If there's nothing, we turn back. I swear." Trent sighed. "Fine, but I'm staying here. You go to the edge and look." Elijah nodded and advanced alone. The sun beat down without mercy, his vision shimmering with heat. As he neared the cliff edge, something caught his eye. A glint of metal, obscured by brush and sand. His pulse quickened. Heart pounding, he crept to the edge of the ravine. Below, half buried and twisted, was a truck. Upside down, the paint dulled by time, but unmistakable. A mountain-shaped sticker, blue, orange, and green, clung stubbornly to its side. "Trent," he screamed, voice cracking. "Trent, get over here!" Trent rushed over, alarm turned to shock as he followed Eli's trembling finger to the wreckage below. "That's my mom's truck," Elijah said, his voice a whisper. "That's her sticker. I'd know it anywhere." For a moment, they stood in stunned silence, the weight of discovery crashing over them like a tidal wave. Elijah's mind raced through a flood of memories. His mom's laugh, Celine's tiny footsteps, the last hug before they left. "We need to get down there," he said at last. Trent eyed the steep slope. "It's risky." "I don't care. I have to know." With slow, deliberate movements they began the descent. Loose gravel gave way beneath their boots, and each step had to be placed with care. Shadows between rocks whispered of danger, but neither spoke of it. When they reached the bottom, the truck loomed above them, weather-beaten, wrecked, but unmistakably hers. One door was crumpled, the windshield was shattered. Desert vines had begun their slow reclamation. Elijah reached out and touched the sticker, tracing the outline with trembling fingers. "This is it," he said. "They were here." Peering inside the wreck, he saw fragments of another life. A pink backpack was wedged between the seats, a silver locket snapped in two. The shattered remains of a phone, its screen long gone but casing intact. Memories flooded in. Celine's giggle, his mother's bedtime stories, gone but not erased. Elijah fell to his knees beside the truck, overwhelmed. They were here. All this time, they were here. Trent crouched beside him. "We need to report this. Call the Rangers." Elijah nodded, but didn't move. "Just give me a minute." And so they sat, two friends in a silent canyon, the past and present finally meeting beneath the endless desert sky. Trent narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, the midday sun glinting off his sunglasses. Then, without a word, he fumbled for his phone and began snapping photos rapidly. "You're right," he said, breathless with surprise. "That's definitely a truck down there." Eli was already scanning the rocky edge, looking for the safest descent. "We need to get down there. There might be something important. Evidence? Anything?" "No," Trent said sharply, stepping forward and grabbing Eli's arm with a firm grip. "Absolutely not. The canyon walls are too steep, and we don't have the right gear for a safe descent. One wrong step, and it's a fall you won't get up from. We need to go back and report this to the authorities." "But," Eli started. "No buts, Eli," Trent cut him off, his voice resolute. This is what you've been searching for all these years. Don't throw your life away now that we're this close. Let the professionals do their job. They're trained for this." Eli's shoulders slumped. His eyes lingered on the truck below, shimmering under the haze of heat and distance. It looked so close, yet impossibly far. After a long moment, he nodded, though every fiber of his being screamed to climb down. He stood silently as Trent marked their coordinates meticulously on his offline GPS app. Once satisfied, Trent gave him a nod, and the two turned to retrace their path through the desert, their return trek marked by pounding hearts and a heavy silence. The drive back felt like an eternity. Trent's battered Jeep tore down the rugged trails, kicking up thick plumes of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. Eli stared out the window, mind racing. His phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications as soon as they re-entered an area with cell signal, but he ignored them all. Instead, he dialed a number engraved into his memory. "Detective Russ Sawyer." The gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Detective Sawyer," came the familiar voice. "It's Elijah Mercer," Eli said in a rush. "We found it, my mom's truck. It's in a ravine, west of the Chinady Mountains." There was a brief silence on the line, heavy with disbelief. "You're sure it's hers?" "Positive," Eli said, glancing at Trent, who held up his phone displaying the photos. "It has her mountain sticker, blue, orange, green, exact match. I can send you the pictures right now." "Send them through," Sawyer said, his voice sharpening with interest, "and give me the exact coordinates." "I'll text them," Eli said as Trent took over driving again. "How soon can you get out there?" "Meet me at the county sheriff's office in Alpine. We'll discuss everything there." As the call ended, Eli turned to Trent. We're heading to Alpine. Trent patted the dusty dashboard affectionately. Good thing my baby didn't let us down. These roads are brutal. By the time they pulled into the sheriff's station lot, Trent practically leapt from the vehicle, brushing sand off the hood and inspecting every inch like a proud parent. Not a scratch, he said, kissing the front grille. Perfect as always. Eli rolled his eyes, but smiled faintly. Inside, they found Detective Sawyer already examining the photos on his tablet. His weathered face, framed by salt and pepper hair, was drawn with concentration. I've alerted the search and rescue team, he said without looking up. If this is Jessica's truck, we can't waste time. It is, Eli insisted. I'd bet everything I own on it. Sawyer nodded, tapping on a map laid out across his desk. The spot you marked is isolated, but we can reach it before nightfall. I've also called in vehicle recovery experts. This won't be a standard operation. Within the hour, a full convoy was ready. Police units, search and rescue, a mobile command post, and a heavy-duty tow truck with winches and cranes designed for extreme conditions. Eli and Trent rode in Sawyer's SUV, following a back route through the terrain. We've got rangers guiding us in, Sawyer explained. There's an old trail that'll get us within a quarter-mile of the canyon. When they arrived, the scene was already buzzing with activity. Search and rescue personnel were unloading gear, and a chopper circled overhead, the rotor wash whipping up clouds of dust. They'll use the helicopter to help stabilize the lift, Sawyer said, motioning toward the cables being prepared. Once secure, the crane will hoist the truck out. Eli watched silently, heart pounding. Minutes passed like hours as the team rappelled into the canyon. The operation was precise, methodical. Cables secured the wreck. The helicopter held position. The crushed truck groaned as it lifted into the air, swaying slightly as it ascended. Finally, it was placed gently on flat ground. Eli stepped forward, but Sawyer held up a hand. Let forensics go in first, the detective said. The vehicle was in horrific shape. Tires shredded, the frame twisted and corroded, windows long gone. Forensic technicians swarmed it, snapping photos, collecting debris, and documenting every detail. "Detective!" one of them called out, a woman with gray-streaked hair and a calm but urgent demeanor. Sawyer walked over, speaking quietly with the team for several minutes. Eli and Trent exchanged nervous glances until the detective returned, his expression grim. "We've got a complication," he said. "Our initial scans show this truck hasn't been sitting there for 11 years. Eli stared, stunned. "What? That's not possible. That's her truck." "I'm not denying it's hers," Sawyer replied, "but we've got records. That exact area was part of the original grid search. The truck wasn't there then." "So how did it get there?" Trent asked. A forensic technician joined them, holding a tablet. "Based on corrosion patterns, sun bleaching, and environmental exposure, we estimate it's been in the canyon for about 7 to 8 years. Sawyer looked at Eli, his voice grave. "That means someone moved it. Your mom and sister disappeared 11 years ago, but this vehicle was dumped there 3 or 4 years later." Eli's world tilted. He felt the ground shift under his feet. So you're saying someone took them?" Sawyer nodded. "It wasn't an accident. Someone had that truck somewhere hidden for years. Then, when the media buzz faded and the search quieted down, they drove or pushed it into that ravine to hide it permanently." Trent exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "That means they were alive, maybe, for a while, somewhere, and nobody knew." The canyon felt suddenly colder despite the heat. The silence around them deepened as the implications settled in. Elijah backed away from the vehicle, his throat tight. "For years I thought maybe it was an accident, maybe they just got lost. But this," he gestured toward the truck. "Someone hid this. Someone wanted it to disappear." Sawyer nodded, his gaze steely. "We'll run the plates, cross-reference shape ownership records, inspect every inch for prints, fibers, anything. If someone moved that truck, they left a trace." Trent glanced at Ellie, his expression darkening. "If your mom and sister were kept somewhere, who would do that? And why wait years to dump the truck?" "That's what we'll find out," Sawyer replied, "but this changes everything. This isn't a missing persons case anymore. It's a crime scene." As the forensic team continued working under the dying light of the desert sun, the sense of finality gave way to a new fire, one fueled by rage, by determination, and by the unshakable truth that someone had gone to great lengths to bury the past. But they hadn't buried it deep enough. For years, Elijah had held onto a simpler explanation. Maybe his mother had taken a wrong turn. Perhaps the terrain had given way under the weight of the truck, sending it tumbling into an unseen ravine. That narrative, however heartbreaking, at least gave him some peace, a tragedy born from misfortune. But now, standing under the vast, darkening sky, knowing someone had gone to great lengths to hide the vehicle, that illusion shattered. His stomach churned at the thought that someone had intentionally hurt his family, and then he calculated how to bury the evidence. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the rugged desert skyline, casting elongated shadows that crept across the rocky ground. The air shifted slightly cooler as the day gave way to twilight. Just then, a young officer approached Detective Sawyer, his gloved hands cradling a dust-caked hard plastic box. "Found this in the truck's storage compartment, sir," he said, his voice calm but alert. It was lodged under the front passenger seat. Sawyer took the box, examining the weathered case. The plastic was warped and faded, nearly fused at the seams by over a decade of desert heat. He carried it over to where Eli and Trent stood, exhaustion and adrenaline still clashing in their expressions. "Recognize this?" Sawyer asked, holding the case up. Eli's eyes widened. "That's my mom's drone case," he said immediately. His voice was laced with both awe and trepidation. He hadn't seen it in years, but he would never forget it. Sawyer knelt and took out a small multi-tool from his pocket. "It's practically welded shut," he muttered, carefully slipping the flat edge into a warped corner. With steady, deliberate motions, he pried at the softened plastic, each crack echoing like thunder in the quiet desert air. Eli held his breath, watching every movement as if the box might disappear before his eyes. With one final tug, the lid gave way. "It's empty," Eli said, the words falling from his mouth with crushing disappointment. He stared at the molded foam interior, once snugly housing a drone and controller. "They took it!" "Would have been valuable even back then," Sawyer murmured, nodding thoughtfully, "especially if they didn't want anyone seeing what was on it." Trent, still peering into the case, leaned closer and squinted at the edge. "Hold on. There's something jammed between the foam and the plastic." With a steady hand, he slipped a finger into the narrow gap and pulled free a thin, dust-covered micro SD card encased in a clear plastic clip. "Good eyes, son," Sawyer said, taking the clip from him carefully. "Let's see what secrets this thing's hiding." They relocated to a temporary command tent, set up just beyond the canyon's edge. Inside was a folding table, a laptop, and a portable power station humming softly. Sawyer inserted the card into a reader slot on the laptop, but the screen stayed blank. "Damaged?" Eli asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Maybe," Sawyer muttered, removing it and examining the metallic contacts. "Corrosion. Pretty heavy." Trent took the card and, using the edge of his shirt, gently rubbed the contacts clean. "Try it now." This time, when Sawyer reinserted the card, a folder popped open. Dozens of video files filled the screen, each time-stamped from the week of the camping trip 11 years ago. "It worked!" Eli breathed, moving closer. His eyes scanned the Pollinish as if each one might bring him closer to the family he had lost. Sawyer opened the first video. The image flickered briefly before revealing Jessica Mercer sitting on the lowered tailgate of the truck, smiling into the lens of the drone. Her blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail, sun-kissed and glowing. Her joy radiated even through the digital screen. Sitting beside her was a small blonde girl in a bright yellow dress. "Celine," Eli whispered. "She was 4. Just 4. The sound of her giggle, so light and unmistakably innocent, filled the tent. She waved up at the camera, beaming. Video after video captured snapshots of their trip. Jessica helping Celine climb into the rooftop tent, them exploring dusty trails hand in hand, laughter echoing across the barren terrain. A woman and her daughter enjoying one final adventure neither knew would be their last. Then came the final video. It began like the others, with the drone lifting from its launch pad beside the truck, but as it climbed higher, it began to pan across the vast desert landscape. "Pause it," Sawyer said, eyes narrowing. "This shot, these ridge lines, the formation near the base, we can match these to maps. That puts them here." Eli squinted at the screen. "That's not where we found the truck." "Exactly," Sawyer replied, his tone grim. "They were in the designated camping zone when this was recorded. The truck was moved?" "No question now." Trent nodded, jaw clenched. "This is a crime scene." Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out a USB drive. "Can I get copies of these?" Sawyer nodded, and one of the technicians began transferring the files. In the background, the forensic team continued its painstaking analysis of the truck, and the heavy-duty tow vehicle backed into position. By now, the sun had dipped below the horizon, bathing the canyon in amber light. Then Eli spotted it. A news van rolling past the perimeter tape, its logo catching the last golden rays of dusk. "Do we really need the press here?" he asked, his voice weary as he nodded toward the reporters setting up lights and cameras. "This case was front-page news for years," Sawyer explained. "The community put everything into searching for your mom and sister. They deserve to know something has finally turned up." Sawyer guided Eli toward the media crew. "We'll also use this to formally announce that the case has been reopened, and we'll need updated images. Celine wouldn't be 4 years old anymore, she's 15 now." The thought froze Eli in place. He hadn't truly considered that. 11 years. His little sister would now be a teenager, practically a stranger. How would he even recognize her? The reporter was already live, standing with the recovered truck silhouetted behind her. "We're reporting tonight from a major breakthrough in the 11-year-old disappearance of Jessica and Celine Mercer," she began, her voice steady and practiced. "Today, their vehicle was located in a remote canyon west of the Chinati Mountains, reopening a case long thought to have gone cold." Trent was the first to speak on camera. "We were just hiking," he explained, "and Eli insisted we check one more ridge. If he hadn't been so stubborn about it, we wouldn't have found anything." When Eli stepped into frame, the reporter turned to him gently. "After all these years, what does this moment mean to you?" Eli swallowed the lump in his throat. He turned to the camera, speaking directly, as though his mother and sister were watching. "Mom, Celine, if you're out there, I never stopped looking. I never will. We're going to find you, I promise." The broadcast ended with Sawyer's statement, confirming the discovery, the recovered footage, and a renewed appeal to the public for any leads or information related to the case. As the cameras shut down and lights dimmed, Sawyer rejoined Eli and Trent. "Let's head back to Alpine. It'll be dark soon." Eli turned once more toward the vehicle, now resting on a flatbed tow truck. Covered in sand, warped and rusted, it was the last surviving piece of the life they once knew, a tangible link to the people he had loved and lost. He lingered a second longer before climbing into the detective's SUV, the desert growing darker behind them with each passing mile. The desert sunset lit the western sky in a riot of oranges and deep purples as Detective Sawyer drove them back toward Alpine. The beauty of it felt almost cruel, a sharp contrast to the emotional weight Eli carried in his chest. As the vehicle rolled down the familiar roads, the station's windows came into view, already glowing softly in the deepening twilight. The calm exterior belied the storm of activity inside. Sawyer parked and shut off the engine. "We're coordinating a full search of the surrounding area for tomorrow," he informed them as they stepped out. "Given what we've discovered, we're treating this as an active crime scene." "I'm coming with you," Eli said without hesitation. Sawyer turned to him, his brow furrowed. "That's not a good idea. The terrain is rough, and we can't guarantee your safety." "I've spent the last 11 years out there," Eli replied, his tone unwavering. "I know that desert better than most of your men." The detective exhaled, silently assessing him. In Eli's eyes he saw the fire of someone who had endured too much to be benched now. "You can wait at base camp," Sawyer conceded, "but if we find anything, you stay put. Understood? You don't move in until the area's secured." Eli nodded immediately, a wave of relief sweeping over him. "Deal." Sawyer turned to Trent. You're not obligated to come. This isn't your burden." Trent looked at Eli, then back at Sawyer. "Someone's got to make sure he doesn't wander off chasing ghosts. He's got a habit of doing that." Sawyer cracked a rare smile. "Then I'll see you both at 600. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be long." With that, the detective drove off, leaving the two friends standing under the glowing street lamps. Trent gave Eli a firm pat on the back. "Let's get you home." As they rode through the quiet streets, the atmosphere felt almost surreal. Though Alpine was a small town, tonight it seemed electric. News of the truck's discovery had spread fast. At a red light, Eli caught a glimpse of a diner's TV broadcasting their earlier interview. The footage looped silently behind the glass as customers sat riveted. "Looks like the whole town's tuned in," Trent remarked, pointing toward a convenience store where people had gathered in front of a mounted screen. "Good," Eli replied softly. "Maybe someone will remember something they didn't think mattered before." They pulled up to Eli's modest house, its porch light glowing warmly in the dark. He'd kept that light on ever since his grandfather died. A silent ritual, a beacon of hope, a sign that someone was still waiting for Jessica and Celine to come home. "You want me to stay over?" Trent asked as Eli unlocked the front door. "I mean, just in case you need—" "I'll be all right," Eli said, managing a tired smile. "I need some time to process, but thanks for everything." "Don't mention it," Trent replied, then grinned. "But don't think you're off the hook. Jenny's expecting that date." Eli laughed, the sound weary but real. "I'll remember." Inside, Eli went straight to his bedroom. The moment the door clicked shut, he moved to his desk and powered on his computer. He slid the USB drive, the one Detective Sawyer had handed him, into the port and waited as the files loaded. One by one, he began reviewing the drone footage. Dozens of clips filled the folder, each a slice of a long-lost memory. As the night wore on, his coffee maker worked overtime. He wasn't going to miss a thing. He watched every video with laser focus, first observing faces, then objects, then landscape features. His mother's smile. Celine's carefree skips, the way the wind carried dust over the truck's roof. Again and again, he scrubbed through the footage, eyes scanning every frame for anomalies, anything overlooked by police or time. It was nearly 2 a.m. when something caught his attention. In one of the longer drone shots, taken from the drone's maximum height, he noticed a jagged ridgeline far off in the distance. The silhouette stood out against the sky like a sawtooth. "That's not on any of the park maps," he muttered to himself. He jumped up and knelt before the old cedar chest at the foot of his bed. Inside, wrapped in faded canvas, were his grandfather's old topographic maps, detailed, annotated, and worn from years of use. He spread them across his desk, cross-referencing ridgelines, valleys, and water paths. Then he found it. Near the western edge of one map, bordering the Chinati Range, was a location marked in red. Pine Military Testing Zone, inactive. In the margin, a note in his grandfather's handwriting read, "Danger, unstable cliffs, restricted since '78. Eli's fingers trembled. That ridge, the one in the video, matched perfectly. "What were you doing out there, Mom?" he whispered. He recalled conversations from his childhood, talks about forbidden zones, about areas once used by the government, about how the land still bore scars no map wanted to show. His grandfather had been a surveyor, his mother an environmental consultant. The wilderness was in their blood. It made sense now why she had insisted on taking Celine out to those remote places. It was a legacy, passed from one generation to the next. He snapped several pictures of the map with his phone and quickly texted them to Trent and Detective Sawyer. The clock read 3:24 a.m. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Too late for replies, too early to stop. But something inside him, something instinctual, told him this was a turning point. By morning, the station was already alive with movement. Officers coordinated gear, charts, and route plans. Eli stepped inside, eyes bloodshot but resolute. At the coffee station, Trent was waiting, holding a cup. "You texted me at 3:30 in the morning," he said, handing it over. "You do realize normal people sleep, right?" "Did you show Sawyer the map?" Eli asked, ignoring the tease. Trent nodded. He's looking into it now. He said it might explain a lot. Eli sipped the coffee, its warmth grounding him. He was exhausted, but alert, focused. Something about that location, the jagged ridge, the handwritten warning, the restricted access, felt important. Too important to ignore. Behind them, officers and technicians loaded supplies into trucks. Radios crackled with updates as teams finalized their assignments. The morning air was crisp, unusually cool for this part of Texas, but charged with anticipation. The sense that something important was waiting beyond those ridges hung over everyone like an unspoken truth. Sawyer emerged from his office, a printed map in hand and a thoughtful crease in his brow. "We cross-checked the ridge with old surveyor files," he said, walking toward Eli and Trent. "There's almost nothing on record past that restricted zone, but we confirmed it's been declassified for over a decade. The warning signs just never got updated." "So it's legal to go out there?" Eli asked. "Technically, yes," Sawyer replied, "but the terrain is dangerous. Unstable rock formations, hidden pits. Your grandfather's note wasn't exaggerating." "Still want me to stay at base camp?" Eli asked, a challenge in his voice. Sawyer eyed him for a long moment before nodding once. "You come. But you stay in visual range of the main team. No wandering off." "Not today." Eli agreed without hesitation. They loaded into a new convoy. 2 marked vehicles, a medical support truck, and a flatbed carrying climbing gear, rope ladders, and portable shelters. The plan was to follow the coordinates Eli had flagged and assess the ridge's proximity to where the drone had captured that final wide-angle shot. As the vehicles rumbled out of Alpine, Eli sat beside Trent, gripping the old map with white knuckles. The red-inked warning, so casually scrawled in the margin by a man now long gone, had become a breadcrumb in a trail of forgotten clues. The desert stretched before them once again, and this time Eli wasn't following hope. He was following proof. Every vibration of the Jeep on gravel was a drumbeat in his chest. Whatever waited beyond that ridge had been hidden for over a decade. And now they were going to find it. "I showed him," Trent confirmed. "But don't get your hopes too high." Eli barely nodded. His heart was already racing. Detective Sawyer approached from the far end of the room, a bundle of files tucked neatly beneath his arm. "Eli, about your discovery." "We need to check the military testing ground," Eli interrupted urgently. "It's marked clearly on my grandfather's maps. He made notes about it. Warnings." Sawyer raised a hand to slow him down. "I admire your thoroughness, Eli, but we can't just march onto a restricted site, even if it's labeled inactive. We need official clearance." "But what if they're there?" Eli pressed, eyes sharp with desperation. "What if whoever took them has been using that facility all this time? It's remote, hidden, perfect for someone trying to disappear." "The site's been inactive for decades," Sawyer replied calmly. "After your message, we looked into it. There are only a few known access points, and most have been overtaken by nature. The roads are unusable, and more importantly, we have no direct evidence tying your family to that place." Eli opened his mouth to protest again, but Sawyer's tone shifted, becoming firmer. "Today's priority remains the area where the truck was found. We'll conduct a full sweep. If nothing comes up, then we'll talk about expanding our scope." Eli recognized the finality in his voice and nodded, the fight in him simmering just below the surface. "Fine," he said quietly. "When do we leave?" An hour later, the team was deep in the desert once more. This time the convoy had doubled in size. More vehicles, more personnel, more gear. At the heart of the operation sat a newly expanded base camp, complete with communication tents, medical supplies, and portable infrastructure. Sawyer handed a satellite phone to Eli and Trent. "You two stay here," he instructed. "We'll be out of radio range at times. If something happens, use this." The search teams dispersed, spreading out across the harsh terrain. As the sun climbed overhead, Eli and Trent settled in under the shade of the main tent. 2 other officers stayed behind to handle communications. Eli paced with mounting frustration while Trent quietly opened his laptop and began typing. "What are you doing?" Eli asked, glancing over his friend's shoulder. "Looking for anything about that old military zone?" Trent replied without looking up. "There's got to be something." Satellite images, old articles, maybe declassified files. Eli stopped pacing, curiosity piqued. "You believe me?" "I believe you're obsessive enough to be right," Trent smirked. "Besides, I'm curious now, too." For the next hour, they dug into obscure forums, archived news databases, and image libraries. What they found was fragmented, scant references to the site's original purpose, mostly redacted government language, and vague allusions to Cold War testing. Nothing concrete, nothing current. Trent leaned forward, pointing at a fresh satellite image. "Look here, this path's overgrown like the rest, but this one?" He zoomed in on a faint line cutting through the brush. "This one's been used recently. See the tire impressions?" Eli's breath caught. Something's out there. One of the officers left behind, a younger guy in his 20s with sandy hair and a curious glint in his eye, stepped forward. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "I could take you to check it out if you want." "Seriously?" Eli asked. He nodded. "Name's Ryan. I've been following your case since before I joined the force. Look, I know what Sawyer said earlier, but if someone's been using that facility, we ought to at least verify it, even if it's unofficial." Trent was already shaking his head. "If Sawyer finds out—" "We'll do a quick recon," Ryan offered. "Stay in the vehicle. If anything looks suspicious, we call it in, immediately. No heroics." "And it stays off the record?" Eli asked. "Completely," Ryan confirmed. "But I won't be responsible if something happens. We'll keep the satellite phone close." Trent hesitated, clearly weighing the risks, but Eli was already on his feet, energized by the lead. "Let's go." After notifying the remaining officer that they were heading out to survey the immediate area, the three climbed into Trent's Jeep and pulled away from base camp, following a new set of coordinates into increasingly remote terrain. As the rocky hills rolled past, Ryan glanced at them from the passenger seat. "I'm serious, by the way. Your mom and sister's case, it's legendary around here. Every academy trainee knows about it." "Not exactly a badge of honor," Eli muttered. "Maybe not," Ryan agreed, "but it stuck with me." They drove for nearly 40 minutes, following barely distinguishable tracks that wound between dry riverbeds and stone outcrops. Eventually, Trent slowed the vehicle. "According to this, the main road should be up ahead. Doesn't look like anyone's used it in decades." "Wait," Ryan said, pointing to their right. "What's that?" A faint trail veered off from the main road, leading toward a cluster of low hills. The brush had been pressed flat, and faint tire tracks marred the sandy soil. "Someone's definitely been through here," Eli said, his pulse quickening. Trent cautiously steered onto the trail. The Jeep bounced across uneven ground as they approached a ridge. As they crested it, Ryan suddenly raised a hand. "Kill the engine." Trent shut it off. Silence fell, save for the wind rustling through dry grass. In the distance, through waves of heat distortion, stood a collection of structures. Low, angular buildings, their paint faded, roofs sagging. Ryan reached for his binoculars. "Some tents, a few old containers. Doesn't look like anyone's there now." He handed the binoculars to Eli, who studied the site carefully. The buildings were clearly abandoned. Glass lay shattered, rust streaked the walls, and the ground was littered with debris. Nothing moved except swirling dust. "Looks deserted," Eli said finally, disappointment heavy in his chest. "We should head back," Ryan said. "Even if it's a bust, Sawyer needs to know someone's using this trail." Eli nodded, though his heart wasn't in it. As they turned the Jeep around, he cast one last look over his shoulder at the lifeless compound. Just hours ago, he'd been sure it held answers. Now, it seemed like another dead end. Back at base camp, the mood was quiet. No major discoveries had been reported. Sawyer and the main team were still hours from returning. The weight of the waiting pressed down like the heat. Eli stood, restless. "I need to see the ravine again. Where did we find the truck?" Trent stood, concern etched across his face. "You think you'll find something we missed?" "I don't know," Eli admitted, grabbing the satellite phone. "But I can't sit here doing nothing." Ryan, now rechecking his gear, paused. "I'll go with you, if it helps keep things safe." Together, they drove back toward the ravine. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, shadows deepened in the canyon's crevices, casting jagged lines across the desert floor. The air buzzed with heat and anticipation. Eli stepped out and stood near the cliff's edge, staring down at the spot where the truck had lain buried in brush and thyme. Now the ground bore the scars of recovery, tracks from the tow rig, boot prints from the forensic team. "It's strange," he said aloud, "how something so huge could stay hidden for so long." Trent nodded quietly. "You were right to keep looking." As the wind stirred dust across the rocks, Eli scanned the ravine once more, and this time his eyes narrowed. Near the spot where the truck had rested, something shimmered faintly. He motioned the others over, heart thudding. "What's that?" They scrambled down the narrow path leading into the ravine. At the base, half buried beneath a cluster of rocks, was a small metallic object. Eli dropped to his knees and began digging carefully. He unearthed a second item, a plastic bracelet, the kind given to children at summer camps. The color was faded, the name tag scratched, but the name was still readable: Celine. The weight of the find hit him like a punch. He cradled the bracelet in his palm as tears filled his eyes. "She was here," he whispered. "She was really here." Ryan radioed the discovery back to the command team. Trent placed a hand on Eli's shoulder but said nothing. Above them, the sun dipped closer to the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the desert. The past was no longer buried. They were finally pulling it into the light. "The recovery site?" one of the officers asked, glancing up from his clipboard. "There's another base tent set up over there for the forensic team. It's within the established safety perimeter." "Can we drive over there?" Eli asked quickly, his tone already shifting toward urgency. The officer nodded. "Should be fine. Just stay on the marked paths and check in when you arrive." Trent sighed, fishing his keys from his pocket. "Let me guess. We're going." "We're going," Eli confirmed, already heading for the Jeep. As they climbed in, Trent squinted at the dashboard and groaned. "We need fuel first. We're running on fumes, and I don't fancy getting stranded in the desert." They navigated to the nearest gas station, a lonely outpost on the edge of the Badlands, its sun-bleached sign flickering dimly in the afternoon heat. The building itself looked abandoned, save for a rusted ice machine humming quietly outside, and the faded posters peeling from the window. Trent pulled up to the pump and stepped out. "I'll go pay," he said, heading toward the small convenience store. Eli stayed by the Jeep, stretching his legs and letting his thoughts drift toward the recovery site. He stared out at the dry, endless horizon, not noticing the dusty pickup truck that pulled in behind them. Nor did he see the four men who climbed out silently, walking toward him with grim purpose. The first punch came from behind, a brutal jab to the back of his head that sent stars exploding behind his eyes. He staggered, trying to pivot, but rough hands grabbed him. He managed to land a solid punch on one of his attackers before a second blow slammed into his temple, sending him spiraling into unconsciousness. Inside the store, Trent dropped the bottle of water he'd been holding as he caught a glimpse through the window. Eli was surrounded. He bolted outside, yelling Eli's name, but before he reached them, the attackers piled into their truck, Eli unconscious in the back, and roared off, tires screeching against the gravel. Darkness, then the pain. When Eli came to, his skull throbbed with a dull ache. He blinked, groggily, disoriented. He was sitting in a wooden chair, arms tied tightly behind him. The room was dimly lit and reeked of stale beer and grease. It looked like an old bar. Windows smeared with grime, neon signs flickering weakly in the background. Through one small window he could just make out the edge of the desert outside. A scar-faced man leaned in, noticing his eyes flutter open. "Hey, he's awake," he called over his shoulder. "It really is the guy from the news." Another man joined him, studying Eli with narrowed eyes. "Boss is gonna love this. Rich boy out looking for mommy dearest. Maybe we can get ourselves a nice little ransom." Before Eli could respond, the door at the far end creaked open. A man stepped in, clearly in charge. Lean build, sharp eyes, a presence that commanded obedience. As the door swung closed behind him, Eli caught a fleeting glimpse of someone else. A young blonde woman holding the door. She vanished before he could process why she seemed familiar. "What the hell did you idiots do?" the leader barked. striding forward and glaring at the others. The scarred man gestured toward Eli. "Boss, this is the kid from the news, the one looking for that missing truck." The leader swore under his breath. "You absolute morons! You were supposed to watch the perimeter, not bring some damn reporter bait right to our doorstep. Now the cops will tear apart the desert looking for him." He turned his back on Eli and whispered harshly to his men, but Eli strained to hear. "Tell the others. Start moving everything. Leave a few clues to throw them off. We're pulling out tonight." Then, with a loud crack, he smacked the back of the scar-faced man's head. "And you'd better hope this doesn't blow everything." Eli cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "I saw her, that girl. That was my sister, Celine." The room froze. The leader turned slowly, his eyes scanning Eli for weakness. "Where's my friend?" Eli asked more forcefully now. "What did you do with Trent?" The man walked up, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You should have left it alone. You should have let the police close the case and move on with your life." "That was my sister," Eli repeated. "I know it. She looks just like Mom." A flicker of something passed across the leader's face. Then, unexpectedly, he softened. "Maybe we can make a deal," he said. "I let your sister go, your friend too. All you have to do is go back to the cops and tell them there's nothing more to find. End the investigation." Eli clenched his fist beneath the rope. "What have you done to her?" "We're just poachers," the leader said with a shrug, his voice taking on a faux casualness, "trying to survive out here. We found your mom and sister camping alone. They had gear, food, and a drone. We thought we'd score easy supplies, but your mom? She wasn't going quietly. She pulled a gun. Fought hard." His tone darkened. "We had to subdue her. She wouldn't stop fighting. Things escalated. We didn't mean to kill her, but it happened." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The girl was too young to understand. With no one to claim her, we raised her, changed her name. She helps with our operation now. She doesn't remember any of it. Not really. Just enough to ask questions now and then. "She's 15, Ellie whispered, his voice shaking with restrained rage. "And resourceful. Loyal. She's one of us. Doesn't know any other life. But if it means getting the cops off our backs, maybe it's time to let her go." He leaned in close. "Think about it. You say the word, and they walk free. But if you make trouble, you'll all disappear into the desert, just like your mom." With that, he signaled his men. They filed out silently, locking the door behind them with a sharp metallic click. Left in the quiet bar, Eli scanned the room. Bottles lined dusty shelves. An old jukebox stood silent against the far wall. His eyes landed on something that made his breath hitch, a drone controller and the drone itself, perched on a shelf behind the bar. His mother's drone. He closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to suppress the wave of emotion rising within him. They had murdered his mother, stolen his sister's life, and now thought they could buy silence? They were wrong. Very, very wrong. As Eli scanned the dim bar room, his eyes fell on a framed photograph half concealed behind dusty liquor bottles. The image showed the abandoned military training ground. One he recognized instantly, but from a new angle. In the photo, several men stood beside old military trucks loaded with wooden crates. They weren't just squatters or petty thieves. They were organized, operational, and using that forgotten compound as their base. Eli's pulse quickened. Whatever these men were involved in, it ran deeper than he'd imagined. The hours that followed dragged with agonizing slowness. Outside the grimy windows, the sun dipped lower, spilling molten gold across the horizon. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional scuff of boots or muffled conversation beyond the door. Eli strained his ears but couldn't make out any words. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. It was her. The girl he'd only glimpsed earlier stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind her. In the better light, Eli could finally see her features clearly. She was tall, her frame lean and wiry. Her hair was golden blonde, tied back loosely, and her eyes, his mother's eyes, were wary but intelligent. "Celine," Eli breathed, standing straighter in his chair. She hesitated, then stepped forward. "No, I'm Lara," she said softly. At least, that's what I've always been told, though sometimes I dream people calling me something else. You are Celine, Eli said, his voice trembling. I'm your brother, Elijah. She tilted her head, studying his face. They said I was found lost in the desert, that they saved me. How do I know you're telling the truth? Ellie didn't flinch. You were 4 when they took you. You're 15 now. That drone on the shelf, it belonged to our mother. You used to call it the flying camera. Dad gave it to her the year before you disappeared. Celine turned toward the shelf. Her fingers touched the side of the drone. Her lips parted and something flickered in her eyes. A flicker of recognition buried under years of confusion. I want to believe you, she said after a moment. I don't remember much, but sometimes I dream about a woman with blonde hair. She called me Celine. That's her, Eli said softly. Our mom. She looked at him, uncertain. They've never hurt me. The boss, he's always protected me. I help with inventory, serve drinks. Sometimes we raid camps, but that's just life out here. It's about survival. They killed our mother, Eli said gently. They kidnapped you. They took everything from you. Celine's gaze dropped. This life? It's all I've ever known. You can have another one, Eli insisted. Come with me, come home. Her hesitation stretched like taut wire. Then finally she reached forward and began untying the ropes around Eli's wrists. I shouldn't be doing this. If they find out, the boss won't like it. We can both leave, Eli said. Now. She stepped back once his hands were free. Your friend, he's in the shed out back. There's a satellite beacon in your pocket. They took it from your Jeep. Don't activate it until you're far away. She moved to the door, pausing. Please, just take the deal. Leave with him. Forget about me. I can't, Eli said, rising. I've been searching for you for 11 years. I'm not walking away now. But before she could reply, the rumble of engines echoed outside. They're back early, Celine whispered, peeking through the window. You need to move, now. She slipped through the door, and Eli followed, heart pounding. He felt for the beacon in his pocket, fingers closing around the small device, but a sudden cry stopped him in his tracks. Celine, he gasped. She was on the ground. A large man loomed over her, his boot pressing against her side. The boss won't protect you now, he sneered. Not after what you did. Eli lunged, only to freeze as the man pulled a pistol from his belt. His eyes darted across the yard, then locked onto the bar counter. A handgun lay there, forgotten. In a flash, he dove for it, fingers curling around the grip. Get away from her, he shouted, leveling the weapon. The man spun, raising his own gun. Around them, others poured from the returning trucks, guns drawn and shouts erupting. Then the front door banged open, and the leader appeared, his face a mask of rage. What the hell is going on? He bellowed. He rushed to Celine, helping her up with surprising gentleness, then turned on his men. I told you not to touch her. She helped him escape, the scarred man said, pointing at Eli. She's with him now. The leader looked at Celine. Is it true? He asked, betrayal creeping into his voice. Celine met his gaze, her chin raised. I heard him. I wanted to know if it was true. If he's really my brother. Family, the leader scoffed, turning to Eli. Where was this brother for 11 years, huh? While I was the one protecting her, raising her, giving her purpose? I never stopped looking, Eli said fiercely. The only reason I found her is because one of your men was careless. You think she's better off with you? The leader shot back. You, who shows up now after more than a decade? I've been more of a family to her than you ever were. Celine looked between them, torn. Her voice broke the standoff. Let him go. Let both of them go. I'll stay. I don't want to leave. No, Eli said, eyes wide with disbelief. Celine! You're right, she told the leader. You always protected me. Fighting elk. But before either man could respond, the rising wail of sirens sliced through the air like a blade. Everyone froze. What's that? The leader growled, turning sharply to Eli. How? The beacon, Eli said calmly, still in my pocket. The shriek of sirens grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls like a war cry from the past. Red and blue lights danced on the far horizon, slicing through the early evening haze. Celine's fingers tightened around Eli's. She hadn't let go, and that was all the confirmation he needed. "We have to go, now," Eli urged, gently tugging her forward. But before they could move, the leader's voice thundered one last command. "Stop them!" A volley of shouts rang out, and two of the henchmen lunged toward them. Eli raised the gun again, not firing but aiming steadily. "Don't," he warned. "I won't miss." It was just enough time. Tires screamed behind the old saloon, and from the dust emerged two black SUVs, skidding into view. Officers in tactical gear poured out, weapons drawn, moving with swift precision. The poachers scattered like startled animals. Some ran, others threw down their weapons and dropped to their knees. Detective Sawyer emerged from the first SUV, shotgun in hand, and eyes scanning the scene until he found Eli. "You okay?" he called, voice sharp but laced with worry. Eli nodded. "She's Celine. She's my sister." Sawyer's eyes softened just slightly. "Secure the area," he barked to the team. "Get the medic here." The leader was gone. Whether he fled through one of the underground tunnels they'd later discover or simply vanished into the desert, no one could say. But for now, the nightmare had cracked open, and light was finally pouring in. As the medics checked over Celine and Eli, Trent came barreling through the crowd. His face was scratched, his shirt torn, but he was alive. He threw his arms around Eli. "Man, you are officially banned from making plans ever again." Eli laughed, a sound raw and unexpected, and hugged him back. "I thought they'd gotten you." "They did," Trent said, wincing, "but not well enough." Celine stood quietly nearby, uncertain and shaken. When Eli turned to her, she looked at him and said softly, "I think I remember the color of our kitchen. Yellow, right?" He smiled through tears. "Yeah, yellow walls, with sunflowers in the corners." The scarred man spat a curse, signaling a wave of panic. Shouts filled the air as the men began grabbing weapons, tossing bags of supplies across the floor, and scrambling to erase any trace of their presence. Amid the frenzy, the leader stormed across the room and grabbed Celine by the arm, dragging her roughly toward the back exit. "You're coming with us," he growled, his grip ironclad. "You know too much now." Eli tried to follow, to pull her back, but someone struck him hard from behind. Pain exploded across his vision as he collapsed onto the floor, blinking against the dull roar inside his head. Through the fog, he could just make out Celine being yanked through the door, her feet skidding against the dirt. "I'm risking everything to save you," he shouted hoarsely, using the last of his strength to raise his voice. "I won't give up on you, Celine." Before the leader could vanish into the desert with his hostage, red and blue lights bathed the bar's front wall in a surreal glow. Police cruisers came to a hard stop, gravel spitting beneath their tires as officers poured out and surrounded the fleeing gang. From his position on the floor, Eli could see the leader's next move in brutal clarity. He grabbed Celine, turned sharply, and pressed a blade to her throat, using her as a human shield. Her terrified eyes locked with Eli's through the dusty window. Gritting his teeth, Eli forced himself to stand. Blood trailed from the corner of his mouth as he picked up the pistol that had fallen beside him. Ignoring the pounding in his skull, he moved deliberately toward the open doorway, gun raised and steady despite his shaking limbs. "You said you'd protected her," Eli called out, his voice raw but resolute. "But you're just like these cliffs, appearing solid until the pressure's on, then you collapse." Celine stood frozen, trembling. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the truth of Eli's words pierced her defenses. She blinked slowly, then reached into her pocket with deliberate calm. A flick of her thumb opened a small folding knife, and in one swift, desperate motion, she turned and stabbed it into the man's side. The leader screamed, his grip faltered, chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions. Officers shouted commands as bullets ripped through the air. Eli rushed forward, pulling Celine away from the fray. Together they stumbled back into the bar, ducking behind the counter as glass bottles shattered above them and splinters rained down. When the last shot rang out, an eerie silence fell. Police swept through the building, subduing the remaining gang members with methodical precision. Outside, medics rushed to treat the wounded. Near the front steps, the gang's leader writhed in pain, the knife still lodged in his side, and a gunshot wound blossoming red across his shoulder. He lay there, bleeding and defeated. Eli helped Celine to her feet and guided her out the door. They stepped into the harsh desert light, blinking against the sudden brightness. A familiar voice called from nearby. Trent was sitting in the back of a patrol car, looking beat up but very much alive. His grin was crooked, one eye swollen, but his spirit remained unbroken. He held up a small metallic disc. "Tracker," he explained with a smirk. "Jenny gave it to me. Said I needed it in case I got lost in the desert again." Eli laughed, the sound catching in his throat. "Your sister is a genius." "Told you she was cool," Trent replied. Then his eyes drifted to the girl beside Eli. "Is this—" Eli nodded. "Trent, meet my sister, Celine." She gave a shy nod, still clinging to Eli's arm as paramedics moved around them. Police vehicles blocked off the area, sirens flashing in every direction, and EMTs attended to the injured with calm urgency. Eli stood still amid the whirlwind, realization slowly sinking in. After 11 years of searching, the mission that had consumed most of his life was finally over. He had found her. But Celine's journey, the real one, was only just beginning. Detective Sawyer arrived minutes later, eyes sweeping across the scene. His face hardened at the sight of blood and debris, but softened when he saw Eli and Celine standing together. "You two can't stay out of trouble for a full day, huh?" he said dryly as he approached, though his tone lacked any real frustration. "I had my sister," Eli explained, still shielding her. "They killed our mother." Sawyer's jaw tensed. He turned to Celine, eyes gentle. "We've been looking for you for a long time." She looked down. "They call me Lara," she murmured. "Did they hurt you?" Sawyer asked softly. She hesitated, then shook her head. "The boss, he protected me, raised me. I worked in the bar, helped with things." "What kind of things?" Sawyer asked carefully. Celine looked away. Across the lot, paramedics loaded the wounded leader into an ambulance, his hands cuffed to the gurney. Eli placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know this is hard. They raised you. They felt like family. But they stole you from your real one." Sawyer crouched to meet her eyes. "You were a child when they took you. You did what you had to do to survive. You're not in trouble, Celine. But if you know anything about their operations, especially that military facility, it could help make sure they never hurt anyone else." She was silent for a long moment. Then her spine straightened. "The old military facility," she began slowly. "They use it for weapons storage. They move shipments in and out for buyers, some from across the border. It's a smuggling hub." Sawyer's gaze sharpened. "How long?" "As long as I can remember," she replied. "The boss said it was perfect. Abandoned, strong buildings, far enough from patrols that no one would come near." Eli clenched his jaw. "They killed our mom. Maybe she saw something. Maybe she was too close." "I don't know," Celine said, tears filling her eyes. "She had expensive equipment. Maybe they just wanted her stuff." Sawyer placed a firm but kind hand on her shoulder. "You've helped more than you know. We'll need a full statement later, but right now we need to act fast." He turned to one of his officers. "Get a warrant for that military site. I want a tactical team ready within the hour." As the officer sprinted off, Celine turned in a slow circle, taking in the flashing lights, the bar she had called home, and the men now being led away in chains. "What happens to me now?" she asked in a whisper. Eli didn't hesitate. "You come home. Where do you belong?" Sawyer nodded but added with quiet caution, "It won't be simple." "There will be questions," Detective Sawyer said as they loaded into the police vehicle. "Statements to take, maybe court appearances. But she's not being charged with anything," he added when he noticed Eli tense beside him. "Right?" Eli asked quickly, his voice firm. "Not at this time," Sawyer confirmed. "She was a victim, not a perpetrator. But the legal system isn't always simple. There's still a process." Celine sat quietly, eyes downcast. "I don't know if I can be normal," she murmured. "I don't even remember what that means." Eli turned toward her. "You don't have to figure everything out today," he said. "We'll take it one step at a time. together. Trent returned from speaking with an officer, looking relieved. "They found my Jeep," he reported. "Those guys were going to take it, but they didn't get far." "Your precious Jeep survives again," Eli said with a tired smile. "Thanks to Jenny's tracker," Trent said. "Told you she was cool." "You might be right," Eli replied. "I owe her big." Celine lingered at the edge of the police car, gazing back at the desert. "I thought I'd never leave this place," she said quietly. "It's all I've known." Eli stepped beside her. "Grandpa used to say the desert gets in your blood. That's why Mom loved it so much." "Did I like it? Back then?" "You loved it," he said. "You'd pick up rocks and chase lizards until Mom made you put them back." A soft smile played at her lips. "I still do that sometimes." She turned toward him, face sobering. "I shot him. Carlos. After everything. I still shot him." "You did what you had to," Eli told her. "He wasn't protecting you. He was keeping you trapped." "I think I always knew," she admitted. "But I was scared. Leaving meant losing everything I thought was real." "You didn't lose anything," Eli said. "You came home." Inside the vehicle, Celine fell quiet again. As they drove through Alpine's winding streets, Eli studied her in the passing light. She was so different from the little sister he remembered, and yet, somehow, still the same. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, finding her, bringing her back, but reality was far more complicated. This wasn't the simple, joyful ending he once dreamed of. It was a beginning. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Mom and Grandpa," he answered. "They never stopped believing I'd find you. Grandpa searched until the very end." "I wish I remembered them more clearly," she said. "I'll help you," he promised. "I've got photos, videos, stories." The cruiser pulled up to Eli's small house, porch light glowing warmly in the dusk, the same light he'd kept on every night for over a decade. "This isn't where we lived, is it?" she asked. "No," Eli replied, "but I left the light on, just in case." She stepped inside slowly, taking in the space. Photos of their family lined the walls. Images of her as a child. Their mother laughing, Grandpa holding her on his shoulders. Her past, captured in snapshots she couldn't remember, but could finally see. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be now," she whispered. "You don't have to know," Eli said. "You just have to be here. Everything else will come." She nodded, her gaze falling on a photo of her mother. Was she happy? She was. "Especially with you." Trent poked his head in from the porch. "Jenny says dinner's on her tonight, by the way. She's proud of her tracker." Eli laughed, the sound genuine and light. "She might have saved our lives. I think I owe her something fancier than dinner." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Eli stood on the porch and looked out at the land that had shaped their family. It had taken his mother, nearly cost him his sister, and consumed more than a decade of his life. But it had also brought them back together. Inside, Celine curled up on the couch, flipping through one of the photo albums. She paused on an old image of her and Eli building a sandcastle, their faces sunburned and smiling. "Do you think it'll ever feel real?" she asked. "It already does," Eli said. "You're here. That's all that matters." And for the first time since she'd returned, she leaned her head on his shoulder, silent but at peace.